In one of the most heroic naval battles of World War II, the destroyer escort USS Samuel B faced overwhelming Japanese firepower in a desperate fight off Samar. Outgunned and outnumbered, her crew fought with unmatched courage, disabling enemy cruisers and buying precious time for the American invasion fleet to survive. But their victory came at a terrible cost. 306 feet of steel sank beneath the Philippine Sea, 115 men lost their lives, and only 95 survived after days adrift in shark-infested waters. Their sacrifice turned near-certain defeat into a defining moment of valor, later remembered as the U.S. Navy's finest hour. At 6:58 a.m. on October 25, 1944, lookouts on board USS Samuel B sighted 4 Japanese battleships appearing about 15 miles to the northwest, while the destroyer escort steamed off Samar Island in the Philippines. The Roberts displaced 1,845 tons, carried 2 5-inch guns, and had a crew of 224 sailors who had been together exactly 5 months and 27 days since the ship's commissioning. Leading the enemy group was Yamato, the biggest battleship ever constructed, displacing 72,000 tons and armed with 9 18.1-inch guns capable of firing 3,200-pound shells out to 25 miles. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland took the intercom and told his crew what had been seen. A large Japanese fleet contacted 15 miles away, 4 battleships, 8 cruisers and numerous destroyers, all closing on the American task force. Copeland warned that they faced overwhelming odds, with little chance of survival, and that they should inflict whatever damage they could. The Japanese center force numbered 23 warships, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, totaling about 200,000 tons. Opposing them were 6 American escort carriers built for anti-submarine work, protected by 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, 7 small warships, with a combined tonnage near 25,000. The Japanese outgunned them roughly 8-1. Admiral William Halsey had taken every American battleship north the previous night in pursuit of Japanese carriers, leaving Taffy 3 alone off Samar. American intelligence reported the Japanese center force withdrawing after air attacks the day before, but they were not retreating. At 3 a.m., the enemy had transited the San Bernardino Strait undetected. Now they were closing at 30 knots, while escort carriers could make at most 18 knots. They could not outrun battleships. To date in the Pacific War, 53 destroyer escorts had been commissioned. None had ever fought battleships. Doctrine assigned them to convoy anti-submarine screens, not head-on engagements with capital ships. In the previous 3 months, Japanese naval action had sunk 4 American escort carriers in the Philippine Sea. Surface action survival rates for carrier crews were about 40%, and roughly 1,200 sailors had died in those fights. At 7:05 a.m., Admiral Clifton Sprague ordered his screening ships to attack. 3 destroyers, Johnston, Hull, and Heermann, charged the enemy, followed by 4 destroyer escorts with Roberts last in line. They had only minutes before Japanese guns began firing. Could this tiny ship survive charging Yamato? Back on the Roberts below decks, Chief Engineer Lieutenant Lloyd Trowbridge heard Copeland's announcement over the intercom. Navy regulations limited Roberts to 24 knots, with safety devices preventing boilers from exceeding design limits. Trowbridge walked to the engine controls and began bypassing the safety systems the Navy had installed. His men watched in silence, understanding that 24 knots would not suffice. At 7:16 a.m., Johnston fired the first shots. Shells arced toward the Japanese formation, and the enemy immediately returned fire. 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo sent water columns 200 feet high, and the destroyer vanished in smoke. At 7:23 a.m., Roberts turned toward the enemy and Copeland ordered flank speed. Trowbridge's alterations pushed the escort up to 28 knots, 4 knots above design. The ship vibrated, metal strained, and steam gauges climbed into the red, but no one objected. Speed meant survival. The Japanese fleet stretched across 10 miles of ocean, with Yamato in the center. Heavy cruiser Chikuma led the right flank about 8 miles ahead of the battleship, followed 2 miles astern by cruiser Tone. On the left, cruisers Haguro and Chokai closed on the American carriers, while destroyers formed a screening line between them. The Roberts needed to breach that screen, reach torpedo range, fire, and escape. Torpedo range was about 5,000 yards, 2.8 miles. Roberts's 3 Mark 15 torpedoes could cover that distance at 46 knots, but closing to 5,000 yards required running through a storm of shells from ships that could hit out to 25,000 yards. The calculation was grim. For every mile Roberts advanced, the Japanese could pour 5 miles worth of shellfire onto her. At 7:32 a.m., shells began landing around the escort. 8-inch rounds from heavy cruiser Chikuma, green dye markers in the splashes guiding Japanese spotters. One shell splashed 50 yards off the port bow, another 20 yards off starboard, and water columns towered over the mast. Copeland ordered hard left then hard right in a zigzag to confuse enemy rangefinders. Gun Captain Lieutenant William Burton stood in the forward 5-inch mount with a crew that had trained 6 months and fired thousands of practice rounds, though never against battleships. The forward gun could fire 15 rounds a minute with a trained crew. Burton had such a crew and carried 608 rounds total, 304 per gun, giving 20 minutes of continuous fire at maximum rate if he did not conserve. Burton's crew numbered 10, loader, rammer, powderman, fuse setter, trainer, pointer, gun captain, and 3 ammunition handlers, average age 22. 2 had never seen combat before. The rest had fought submarine engagements, which did not return fire with 14-inch guns. At 7:38 a.m., Copeland announced they were closing for a torpedo attack. Roberts was 7,000 yards from Chikuma, still 2,000 yards too far. At 28 knots, that meant roughly 2 more minutes under falling shells. A single direct 8-inch hit could penetrate Roberts's thin hull plating and explode inside, killing all in that compartment. The forward gun mount's 3 8-inch plating was meant to stop splinters, not shells, so a direct hit on the mount would instantly kill its 10 men. At 7:40 a.m., Roberts crossed inside 5,000 yards, and Copeland ordered the tubes fired. 3 Mark 15 torpedoes left the starboard side, their white wakes cutting the water at 46 knots and taking about 2 minutes to reach the target. The torpedoes ran true, but the enemy reacted. Chikuma's lookout saw the wakes. The cruiser turned hard to port in emergency, heel angling as 8,000 tons tried to maneuver. The first torpedo passed 50 yards ahead. The second missed the stern, and the third ran beneath without exploding. Mark 15 contact exploders had roughly a 40% failure rate. Roberts had fired 3 duds but achieved a tactical success. Chikuma broke off her attack run to evade, losing 5 minutes of pursuit time, minutes the escort carriers could use to head south, an inch closer to possible rescue by Halsey's fleet. At 7:45 a.m., Roberts re-emerged from the smoke. Chikuma completed her turn and resumed course toward the carriers, but was now about 8,000 yards away, too distant for another torpedo run. Copeland ordered Burton to open with the forward 5-inch. The mount slewed to the target, elevated to maximum, and fired. The first shell left the barrel at 2,600 feet per second and took about 12 seconds to fly, landing 400 yards short. Burton adjusted and fired again. That shell fell 200 yards short. The third splashed near Chikuma's bow. The fourth found its mark, striking the forward superstructure, penetrating and detonating inside with smoke pouring from the impact. Burton's crew settled into a rhythm of load-ram fire at up to 15 rounds per minute, as the barrel heated and recoil cycled. Spent casings piled inside the mount. After 5 minutes of continuous firing, Burton had used 75 rounds, about 5% of his ammunition, and scored hits on Chikuma, though the extent of damage was unclear. The cruiser continued to return fire and press toward the carriers. At 7:52 a.m., Chikuma shifted her guns from the carriers to Roberts. 8-inch shells began landing perilously close. One exploded 30 yards to port, spraying shrapnel across Roberts's hull. Another struck 20 yards to starboard, its blast rocking the ship. A third hit the water 10 yards off the bow, the splash drenching the forward gun mount and pouring seawater through the gun ports. Burton's crew kept firing with water swirling around their feet. The gun was built to operate wet from training in simulated flooding, because destroyers fight in all seas. This was no drill. The Japanese were dialing in their range. At 8:03 a.m., destroyer Johnston took a direct bridge hit from Congo's 14-inch guns. The explosion killed her executive officer and wounded her captain, reducing her speed to 17 knots and shifting steering control aft while she continued to fight. 3 miles north, Destroyer Hole engaged heavy cruiser Haguro and had already suffered multiple hits that destroyed a forward mount and flooded the No. 3 engine room, leaving her making only 15 knots on one engine. Roberts remained intact, still running 28 knots and still firing at Chikuma, but ammunition was dwindling. After 18 minutes of sustained fire, Burton had expended 270 rounds from the forward gun, about 90% of that mount's supply, leaving 34 rounds. At that consumption rate, the gun had roughly 2 minutes and 16 seconds of firing left. At 8:07 a.m., Copeland ordered Burton to change target. Heavy cruiser Tone had closed to 7,000 yards, nearer and more threatening. Tone carried 8 8-inch guns and was firing at escort carrier Gambier Bay. Shellfire was falling ever closer to the carrier, each burst narrowing the gap. Burton swung his mount to the new bearing, elevated for a 7,000-yard shot and fired. The projectile arced toward Tone, splashed short. He adjusted and fired again. This time the shell struck Tone's No. 2 turret, punched through the armored face and detonated inside. The turret stopped turning and went silent. With a 5-inch gun, Burton had just put 1/4 of the cruiser's main battery out of action. At 8:10 a.m., the Roberts forward gun exhausted its ammunition, 304 rounds gone. The barrel was white-hot, metal dull red, recoil parts overstressed and oil smoking from the recuperator. The crew had driven the mount beyond every Navy limit. They were out of rounds. The aft mount, under gunner's mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr, still had ammunition, 325 rounds. Carr was 20, from Chautauqua, Oklahoma, enlisted May 1942, gunnery trained at Great Lakes and assigned to Roberts 6 months earlier. This was his first surface fight. His 10-man crew averaged 21 years old and had been firing non-stop since 7:45, 25 minutes, 324 rounds spent, 1 round left. At 8:15 a.m., 3 Japanese heavy cruisers bracketed Roberts, Chikuma to starboard, Tone to the northeast, Haguro to the northwest, closing to 6,000, 5,000, 4,000 yards. Smoke and maneuvering room were shrinking. Time was almost gone, and the ship was about to take her first serious hit. At 8:20, an 8-inch shell from Chikuma struck amidships on the port side, punched through the thin hull plating, passed through the galley and out the starboard side without detonating, leaving a 3-foot hole. Seawater poured into the lower decks. Damage control rushed in, stuffing mattresses into the breach and shoring buckled bulkheads, while the ship listed 5 degrees to port. 2 minutes later, another shell detonated, blowing through the crew's berthing compartment, killing 6 men outright and rupturing steam lines. Superheated steam scalded 4 more sailors. Roberts' speed fell to 24 knots, then 20, as one boiler went offline and Trowbridge battled to keep the remaining boiler running. At 8:25, the aft mount under Paul Carr lost electrical power. The rotation train stopped, the hydraulic ram that loaded rounds went dead, and the firing circuit failed. The crew switched to manual operation, the way all destroyer escort crews were trained. Slower, harder, but possible. The trainer and pointer cranked the mount by hand. The loader and rammer hoisted each 54-pound shell and rammed it into the breech, and the gun captain tripped the firing pin by hand. Rate of fire fell from 15 rounds per minute to 6 or 7 at best. Carr's crew was fast and they kept the mount working, cranking, loading, ramming, firing. The recoil threw tons of force into the mount. The deck plates bowed. The barrel glowed red and the interior temperature climbed to roughly 130 degrees. Sweat, seawater from near misses and steam from ruptured lines soaked everyone. At 8:30, disaster struck the aft mount. A powder charge cooked off in the overheated breech, and the mount detonated. The blast tore the gunhouse apart, killed 3 men instantly and wounded 7 more. Shrapnel shredded the interior. Carr was hurled against a bulkhead, and a jagged steel fragment tore from his neck to his groin, opening him wide. He fell, intestines exposed and bleeding, mortally wounded. Yet he tried to keep going. He saw the ammo rack and the single remaining shell, the last round in the magazine. He crawled to it, gripped the 54-pound projectile, couldn't lift it alone, couldn't stand, but clung to it with blood pouring from his wounds. He wanted that shell loaded and fired. Machinist's mate 2nd Class Chalmer Gohan found him clutching the round and, despite Carr's refusal to move, helped pry him away from the ruined mount and dragged the shell back. The gun was destroyed, the breech shattered and the firing mechanism gone. That last round could not be fired. Carr either did not understand that or refused to accept it. He died 5 minutes later, still trying to reach his gun. At 8:35, a massive shell, a 14-inch round from either Congo or Haruna, hammered the starboard side and ripped into the number 2 engine room, exploding there. The blast tore a 40-foot by 10-foot hole, flooded the engine room in 30 seconds, and killed 8 men instantly. Roberts' speed collapsed to 10 knots, then 5. Then she lay dead in the water. Copeland ordered everyone topside. The ship was dying. No power, no steering. 3 feet of water on lower decks and fires burning in 4 compartments. The Roberts lurched down by the stern. At 8:45, more shells struck. 6-inch rounds from light cruiser Noshiro and 8-inch hits from Haguro, pounding the stricken escort. Each blow killed or wounded more sailors. The ship had become a sitting target. At 9:10, Copeland ordered abandon ship. 115 men were dead or missing. 109 survivors prepared to go over the side. They had 3 inflatable rafts, but 2 had been destroyed. 1 remained, rated for 16. The wounded were put in that raft while everyone else entered the water, clinging to floating wreckage, empty shell cases, and 2 floater nets that drifted nearby. At 9:35, Roberts rolled to port. Her bow lifted toward the sky while the stern slipped beneath the waves. She hung 10 seconds and then sank stern first, the bow following. 306 feet of warship vanishing into 3,600 feet of Philippine Sea, the deepest combat loss of an American warship. 109 men were left in the water, many wounded, burned or broken, all smeared in thick black fuel oil from ruptured tanks that got in their eyes, mouths and lungs, making men vomit and some pass out. The water temperature was about 84 degrees, warm enough to prevent immediate hypothermia. But they had no food, no fresh water, and no rescue in sight while the battle still churned around them. Japanese warships steamed past without stopping. At 9:45 a.m., Admiral Takeo Kurita ordered the center force to withdraw. His cruisers had suffered heavy damage from the destroyers and from aircraft. Chokai was dead in the water, Chikuma burning, Suzuya's torpedoes detonated by a near miss, and Kumano's bull blown off by a torpedo. 3 heavy cruisers were critically damaged. Kurita's staff had believed they were fighting a fleet carrier task force and insisted they faced Halsey's 3rd Fleet. They were mistaken. Taffy 3's escort carriers were light. Ersatz flat-tops and the destroyers were small, lightly armed escorts. But the confusion bought the Americans precious minutes and saved the invasion fleet. The Japanese turned north and steamed back toward San Bernardino Strait. The Battle off Samar was over. 3 American ships had been lost. Destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts and destroyers Johnston and Hole, and escort carrier Gambia Bay capsized under Yamato's 18-inch guns. In all, just 277 American sailors were dead or missing and another 1,000 wounded. But Leyte Gulf's invasion fleet survived. MacArthur's troops kept landing, and supplies continued to flow ashore. The Japanese had squandered their last chance to halt the Philippine campaign. In the water off Samar, the 109 Roberts survivors drifted as the fighting receded, and silence settled over the sea. No engines, no gunfire, only waves lapping at life jackets. They clustered around the single raft and 2 floater nets, with the wounded inside the raft, and the rest clinging to edges, nets or floating debris. They spread across roughly a quarter-mile of ocean, in small groups trying to stay together. The fuel oil was the worst enemy. It coated skin and hair, stung the eyes, burned in the mouth, and made many vomit until they grew weaker by the hour. As the sun climbed above 90 degrees and humidity baked them, dehydration and infection set in. Burns festered quickly in the tropical heat, and open wounds exposed to seawater and oil became infected. At 2:00 p.m. on October 25th, sharks appeared, small black-tip reef sharks at first, about 6 feet long, circling and bumping survivors to investigate. One sailor removed his oily clothes to swim more easily and exposed pale skin. A shark became more insistent, nudged his leg and forced him back onto a floater net, where he cut his hands on rough rope. Later, larger sharks, 8 to 10 feet, tiger and bull sharks, approached with greater aggression. Survivors could not confirm kills, but 2 men vanished. During the first night after splashing and thrashing were heard. Then silence. Night brought relative chill as water dropped to about 78 degrees. After 12 hours immersed, some men shivered and hypothermia affected wounded men, whose core temperatures fell. 3 more died that first night, their bodies pushed away from the raft and lost to the dark. October 26 brought brutal sun and worsening dehydration. Some men hallucinated ships, land or rescue planes on the horizon, while others fell unconscious with cracked lips and swollen tongues. 5 more died on the second day, and their bodies drifted away. Copeland kept survivors organized, talking and awake. Sleeping meant slipping under the water and drowning. He grouped men, assigned leaders, and had them count off every hour. Anyone who failed to answer was checked and shaken awake. Because of his insistence, 14 men died over 3 days, but 95 lived. At 7:45 a.m., on October 27th, a patrol craft on escort duty north of Samar spotted wreckage, bodies, and life jackets. The PC, escorting 5 landing craft, approached cautiously because Japanese survivors were known to feign death and then attack rescuers. The patrol craft stopped 50 yards away and called out jokingly, asking who had won the World Series. An American voice answered, "St. Louis Cardinals." The ship moved in and began rescue, which took 4 hours. 95 men were pulled from the water, some needing carrying aboard and all treated for dehydration, burns, wounds, infections, and oil poisoning. The worst cases went to Hospital Ship Comfort, bound for Hollandia. Others were taken to Leyte, and later to San Francisco aboard transport Lurleen, arriving December 4th, 3 weeks before Christmas. The Battle off Samar entered history as one of the greatest last stands. 7 small ships facing 23 warships, turning them back and saving the invasion fleet. A clash that likely shortened the war's timeline. Admiral Chester Nimitz called it the Navy's finest hour, and historian Samuel Eliot Morison said no naval action showed more gallantry. Samuel B. Roberts earned the Presidential Unit Citation. Copeland received the Navy Cross. Paul Carr was awarded the Silver Star posthumously. The Navy later honored them with ships bearing their names. In 1982, a frigate named for Copeland. And in 1985, a guided missile frigate commissioned as USS Carr. In June 2022, explorer Victor Vescovo located Roberts at 22,621 feet down, about 4.3 miles deep. The deepest shipwreck ever found, deeper than Titanic. The wreck sits upright with bow separated from stern, but still recognizable. The gun mount where Carr died remains visible in the footage, silent and waiting. The last survivor, Alfred Lenore, died March 20, 2022, at age 97, just 3 months before his ship was found. That is the tale of a small destroyer escort that fought like a battleship and of a crew that refused to yield even when survival was impossible.